I have some video footage, several clips here that I want to share from yesterday from the 18th. They were really just beaming shit really hard. It was heavy. The frequencies were very thick, and last night wasn't a very good night because I didn't sleep very well, sweating profusely. I had heart palpitations once in a while. I was getting little dizzy spells and shit. The whole time I was recording all of this going on in the skies, I was sweating profusely, and the sun was going down behind us. It wasn't even shining. I wasn't even in the direct sunlight. But I'm going to share these different clips showing some of this frequency beaming that was going on, and it was definitely associated with HARP. You know, not just HARP, but the ground-based little radar bubble stations too. It all influences our weather patterns, and it creates these types of louvers and wild and crazy looking clouds like this. It was just insane. And but I'm going to share these different clips that I have. I have several different clips showing a lot of what was going on yesterday, and some moon in there too, moving up through the clouds. And the audio file is going to be some additional information on HARP. So there's an upload notice for you. Some interesting harped up skies from yesterday with just a little bit more information about HARP. Because I do think that there are still a lot of people that are just so ignorant and they just don't want to believe that, you know, that they can influence our weather patterns and influence our upper atmosphere by beaming all these radio waves and different stuff into the ionosphere. And I think it's kind of curious that um, there's this article here, research article that was published from Advancing Earth and Space Sciences, um, talking about an extreme auroral electrojet spike during the 2023 April 24th storm. Okay. The event was triggered by a solar wind pressure pulse. Remember that word pulse, okay? Which enhanced diffuse auroral precipitation and ionospheric conductivity. All right. And just for reference, this article was received November 8th of 2023. It was accepted March 11th, 2024. And then it was corrected in May of 2024. And then it was published in June. Okay. This is the cover for it right here. AGU Advances Volume 5, Issue 3 from Advancing Earth and Space Sciences. Okay. There are top scientists, right, that are studying our ionosphere, right? Okay. Folks, I think this was damage control. This was an article put out at damage control. But just remember the word pulse, okay? Because I wanted to help tie in some different things that would make the suggestion that this particular event was directly attributed to HARP projects. It has HARP all over it, the signature on it and everything. It's all over HARP all day long, okay? And it's interesting that they say abrupt variations of auroral electrojets can induce geomagnetically induced currents, and the ability to model and forecast them is a pressing goal of space weather research. We report an auroral electrojet spike event that is extreme in magnitude, explosive in nature, and global in spatial extent that occurred on 24 April 2023. So here it is, over a year later, they published an article that's allowed for the public to view. This was just published this month, over a year ago. This supposed event occurred, right? More keywords. The event serves as a fundamental test of our understanding of the response of the geospace system to solar wind dynamics. None of these scientists that work on this kind of stuff, when it comes to space weather and all of that space science stuff, they wouldn't have a job and they wouldn't have nothing to study and research if it wasn't for HARP creating the simulations and simulating the environments and the extreme conditions that they need to study, right? This stuff does not happen naturally, and this was not a naturally occurring event. This aurora electrojet spike was not natural, okay? Just listen to the keywords, all right? Our results illustrate new and important characteristics that are drastically different from existing knowledge. There we go. They're changing the dynamics, the physics of it. Okay. They're actually in so many words acknowledging that there are influences and things that can influence that upper atmosphere and that ionosphere to create space weather. Okay. Most important findings include A, the event was only of 5-minute duration and was limited to a narrow 2 to 3 degree band of diffuse aurora. B, the longitudinal span covered the entire night side sector, possibly extending to the day side. And C, the trigger seems to be a transient solar wind dynamic pressure pulse. There's that word again. Remember the word pulse. A possible explanation is that the pressure pulse compresses the magnetosphere and enhances diffuse precipitation of electrons and protons from the inner plasma sheet, which elevates the ionospheric conductivity and intensifies the aurora electrojet and otherwise supercharging that electrojet, the aurora electrojet, that current, that electrical current. In case you don't know what an aurora electrojet is, it says auroral electrojets are horizontal electric currents that flow in the auroral ionosphere. This is the current, this is the electrical current that they have been exploiting and using to direct energy around our planet, okay? Therefore, the event exhibits a potentially new type of geomagnetic disturbance and highlights a solar wind driver that is enormously influential in driving extreme space weather events. So they have found an a driver, a solar wind driver, something that influences the auroral electrojet, spikes it, and causes a geomagnetic disturbance and drives extreme space weather events. Remember the word pulse. Okay, I'm just going to do a find on page here real quick for the word pulse. Oh, there it is. It's still in there when I just searched it before. 37 times the word pulse is mentioned in this 20-page paper. Okay, this is only 20 pages. 37 times the word pulse. A transient solar wind dynamic pressure pulse. A possible explanation is that the solar wind pressure pulse compresses the magnetosphere. Stick with me. The event spanned a wide local time where the geomagnetic field pulsed synchronously in sync over almost the entire night side sector. Okay. Finally, the event was not driven by disturbances in the magnetotail like substorms or MPEs like normal, but this event was by a solar wind dynamic pressure pulse, which has not previously been recognized to be important in statistical studies. Now, why wouldn't you figure in this dynamic solar wind dynamic pressure pulse, okay, which was not previously recognized, right? For example, Rogers et al. 2020 reported that more than 5% of the auroral zone geomagnetic perturbations, disturbances, were preceded by a solar wind pressure increase. The event highlights the influential role of solar wind pressure in driving extreme geomagnetic disturbances. So, in other words, if you can tap into that auroral electrojet and spike it like you would spike the punch at your high school prom, you can increase that solar wind pressure, therefore increasing extreme geomagnetic disturbances, therefore creating additional space weather situations and events. And why would you do something like this? Somebody might ask, well, why would they do something like that? Well, why wouldn't they? Hello? Why wouldn't they? They would do it so that this long list of people that did this research would have something to do with their time, and they could create all of these additional events now that they can understand what their harping does to it. Their pulsing. Remember the word pulse. That's still got to get through more pulses. There's still the solar wind pressure pulse mentioned here. We have the embedded in the second interval is a distinct solar wind pressure pulse. The brief nature is consistent with the transient compression of the magnetosphere sensed by the SMR index, and the timing supports the notion that the pressure pulse was the solar wind driver of the auroral electrojet spike. Let me repeat that. The timing supports the notion that the pressure pulse was the driver for this particular auroral electrojet spike. Okay. Now they supposedly have this satellite system up there, Themis, and it was most likely drifting up there on a balloon, right? They're weather balloons, right? Themis, which was located close to the bow shock nose and sensed the pressure pulse arrival around 3:53 universal time. There, it shows you on the little graph there. There's a little pulse that was detected, right? Folks, specifically prior to the large pressure pulse, a comparatively small enhancement was initiated. Yeah, the total pressure. Let me see. The auroral electrojet spike initiated at the largest enhancement, which appeared as a pulse. The pulse occurred. The timing, amplitude, and duration of the pulse all match the pulse seen in the discovered data. It is worth mentioning that this pulse was also captured by sensors on board magnetospheric multi-scale mission located around the bow shock in the southern hemisphere. Although these results indicate that the solar wind pressure pulse was the upstream condition of the auroral electrojet spike, it is at first glance unclear whether the pulse was the direct driver of the spike or whether it triggered the energy unloading in the magnetotail, which caused it, which leads to the spike, which leads to substorms, which leads to space weather. So they don't know whether or not it was the pulse itself was the direct driver of the spike, or whether or not it was the pulse triggering the energy inside of the auroral electrojet to create this particular event where it spiked. Pulse, remember that. I'm telling y'all, this to me is like a level of ignorance on these scientists' part, that there's no mention of HARP. There's no mention of the possibility that it could be attributed to these experiments going on at HARP. And again, we're looking at the word pulse. The most striking solar wind feature associated with the event is the transient pressure pulse, which enhanced diffuse particle precipitation through the magnetosphere compression, as opposed to through triggering the substorm. The pressure pulse was mostly due to solar wind density enhancement, which HARP has already proved in multiple projects that they can increase it and enhance the solar wind density. They can enhance it with their pulses. Short duration of pressure pulse. The pressure pulse lasted about 2 minutes. The pressure pulse was mostly due to solar wind density. I mean, really? And again, show you this was published in Advancing Earth and Space Science. And when we look at even this particular article here from Stanford, experiments with the HARP ionospheric heater. This is the very low frequency group, right? The VLF science at HARP. I'm just going to scroll down to show y'all what I'm talking about here. Yeah, a Stanford students and the buoy on the RV Tangoro before deployment. All right, here we go. Remember talking about the AURORAL ELECTROJET, right? Which they detected a spike in that current, in the energy that was flowing back on April 24th of 2023, over a year ago, okay? This pulse and this spike was detected, right? Well, let me see here. Electrojet dependence. A disadvantage. Let me see if I can zoom in on this. Yeah, I can. No, too far. All right, here we go. A disadvantage of using HARP instead of conventional ELF BLF transmitters is that HARP's dependence on the auroral electrojet, which naturally varies in intensity and can cause the generated ELF to also vary in intensity. And it's the variables involved in that current, and trying to control that current is going to be impossible. Okay? And that's what they're doing. It's ridiculous to me that too many people just still want to believe that it's just science fiction, but they're doing it. And they've been doing it. And when I record stuff like this going on in the sky, I can see that there is a physical disturbance. There is something influencing this cloud structure up here, because this is not natural. These are not natural forming cloud structures that we see when we see all of these louvers and we see all of these frequencies and things being detected. This is not natural. It's being influenced, and it's being influenced by HARP, a combination from HARP and from NOAA and their little radar stations that they have all tied into it and all coordinated in tracking all of their beams and their radio waves and their signals. You know, they've been doing this stuff for decades. And the fact that this article comes out talking about this extreme auroral electrojet spike over a year ago, now you're telling us? Now you're gonna release this paper right here, because this paper doesn't mention one freaking word about HARP and their experiments that they do, where HARP depends upon that auroral electrojet, where they state here that it's a disadvantage to HARP of using HARP is because it depends upon that auroral electrojet, which naturally varies in intensity and can cause a generated ELF to also vary in intensity, which means it doesn't allow them to control it. However, the correlation is not direct, and surprisingly strong ELF signals can be detected even when the electrojet is negligible. Magnetometers, which measure the Earth's magnetic field, can detect disturbances caused by overhead currents, are a simple proxy for electrojet intensity. When the electrojet suddenly becomes much stronger, the ELF detected at Christochina, interesting name, Christochina, only becomes slightly stronger, and at Juno becomes somewhat weaker. Discovering how natural conditions affect HARP's ability to generate ELF is a key for determining the practicality of using modulated heating as an ELF source, and for using modulated heating as another diagnostic tool in studying the atmosphere. And the practicality, you know, this is practical use of beaming our ionosphere with unnatural and ungodly amounts of energy for research projects. So thank goodness that these people that do these experiments where they're beaming and depending upon the auroral electrojet, thank goodness for them, they have all of these scientists here ready to step up and write a paper talking about their work in so many words without actually mentioning their name. They mention the word pulse, and that's because the word pulse, it's been used. I mean, HARP creates airglow by exciting electrons in Earth's ionosphere, similar to how solar energy creates natural aurora, with on and off pulses of high frequency radio transmissions. Another one, HARP high power experiments and observations of ionospheric interactions. This is coming straight from the Navy, Naval Research Laboratory. Okay, let's look for the word pulse. Hang on, find on page pulse. Okay, so 10 times in this 5-page paper from Naval Research Laboratory, the word pulse is used because that's what they do. They pulse the ionosphere with these energies. HARP illuminated, interesting choice of words, the moon with a series of 100 millisecond pulses at high power for 2 hours. During the experiment, the HARP transmission beam rotated to follow the moon's apparent motion across the sky in order to keep both wind and the moon within the radio beam. Thus, wind detected both the direct HARP pulses as they passed by the spacecraft on their way to the moon, blah, blah, and the echo from the lunar surface. You don't say, well, you sure that it wasn't just an echo from the ionosphere, or maybe possibly a dome or ceiling of some kind. The timing of HARP pulse transmissions was arranged so that the direct and echo pulses would not overlap. So in other words, they beam out a pulse and there's an echo that comes back. They don't want that to overlap. The echo signals are of lower intensity than the direct pulses because the lunar surface is not 100% efficient reflector of radio frequencies. You're right, whatever. It's not that because the pulse and the energy from the pulse loses its energy once it bounces off of something like, say, a ceiling or something, right? The relative intensities of the direct and echo pulses will allow us to estimate parameters such as the lunar surface scattering cross section. Okay, yeah, bullshit. It's bouncing off of something else. It's not bouncing off of a physical object. It's not bouncing off of the moon. It's bouncing off of something else up there, and it's a pulse. My point is, it's the pulse. It's the pulse. Okay. HARP uses pulses. It's in several other documents where they do their experiments and they pulse. So how curious is it that back on April 24th of 2023, there was an extreme auroral electrojet spike triggered by a transient. The trigger seems to be a transient solar wind dynamic pressure pulse, a pulse, huh? You don't say, well, where did this pulse come from? Oh, well, we don't know. I know. And I bet you these people know too, which I find very curious that when you look up the corrections that was made, this article was corrected on 11 May 2024. And when you scroll down and you look at the correction that was made before it was published up and put out there for common public, viewing and use, as soon as this loads, I'll show you. Let me get rid of that. The correction was made in the acknowledgement section. The acknowledgement section omitted the support from co-authors Jesper W. Zhirlov and Shin Otani. Interesting name, huh? We've heard the name Otani in the news, haven't we? The following should be added after the first sentence of the acknowledgements, that JG is supported by NASA for this particular study and this particular study and this particular study here, that SO Shin Otani is supported by NASA, of course. The error has been corrected, and this may be considered the authoritative version of the record. So they published it and they put it out in March, and then they had to go through and do a correction. But when they initially published it and sent it in to this research group and this research article and this information, they had to correct that 2 months later. And then it was just published and released in this full text in the beginning of this month, in June. So over a year. And the name Shin Otani, you notice that they're number 2 and number 3. But in the original one, they weren't in there at all. They weren't included in there at all. And it's kind of interesting because when you look up the Otani, what do you get? You get all this information about this, baseball player involved with this gambling scandal and this shit, right? Well, the Shin Ichi Otani, who is a space scientist, contributed to this particular article here talking about electrojet spike that occurred. And he contributes to various areas of magnetospheric physics, including magnetosphere-ionosphere coupling. That's self-explanatory. Attempting to couple the magnetosphere and the ionosphere. Okay, then nothing can go wrong there. Substorms, magnetotail dynamics, studying the magnetotail, right? The electromagnetosphere, the storm time ring current, the solar wind and magnetosphere, and ultra-low frequency waves. Dr. Otani has co-authored more than 200 peer-reviewed journal articles. And where did he go? University of Tokyo. So we have somebody from Japan weighing in on and doing research into these ultra-low frequency waves as well, which is something that was mentioned in their article here, where they talk about these VLF, very low frequency waves, and their HARP's dependence upon the auroral electrojet. And this is not new stuff, though, really. This was an article that was put out in 2010 talking about substorm triggering by new plasma intrusions. Well, I wonder what plasma intrusions could be going on in the ionosphere that could influence some of these substorms and this space weather. I just wonder. You have small-scale field-aligned currents observed by the Akibono satellite, which was most likely drifted up on a balloon. And again, recognizing these different anomalies and things going on in that auroral electrojet, in that current. And then HARP pulsing things for their experiments. How convenient, like I said before, because I'm repetitive, I got to say it again, how incredibly convenient for HARP and advancing Earth and space sciences that there was this event that occurred, this auroral electrojet spike, that they still can't say what it was. All they can do, of course, is speculate. But just by saying in so many words that this event was triggered by a solar wind pressure pulse, and saying that it was triggered by this transient solar wind dynamic pressure pulse. In so many words, you're saying it was caused by a pulse. And what do we know causes pulse? What do we know that uses pulses? It's not rocket science when it comes to some of this information. And I find this article very curious that was published in this whole AGU advancing Earth and space scientists. And you have all of these scientists just signing on to it. Volume 5, issue 3, just published due in 2024. And then I capture stuff like this going on in the skies. And then, last night was not a very comfortable night. I was sweating profusely. Even while I was recording all this stuff going on out there, I wasn't in direct sunlight, but I was still sweating profusely. And, I had little slight dizzy spells and shit when I went to go lay down last night. I didn't have the piercing headaches like I have a lot of times when I see this stuff in the sky. A lot of times I'll end up with these piercing headaches. I didn't have any of that, but I did have the sweating, and I did have, some little bouts of what seemed like vertigo coming on. So you're not going to tell me that it's not having an effect on people here at ground level when they're manipulating and altering our upper atmosphere and influencing what they call space weather. You know, it's ridiculous to me how much that HARP has been allowed to get away with, and for how long they've been able to get away with it. You know, and it's okay that that the Navy just handed over this fucking facility that was being used to develop weapons of mass destruction and directed energy technology. We're just okay with the fact that they just handed it over to the University of Alaska. We paid for it. We paid for this naval research laboratory. I don't know. I don't ever remember reading anything in the history books where it was actually put up to a vote that it was okay for the Navy just to hand over this fucking high powered, array system to the University of Alaska for research. I don't consent. I never will either. Not to these types of experiments that cause spikes in their auroral electrojet that influence and create space weather, that trigger space weather and substorms that then end up coming down and bringing more extreme weather down here to ground level. I wonder why we're having the issues that we're having right now with our extreme weather conditions all over the place, not just here in our country, but all over the freaking world, because this event here appeared to have like a global in spatial extent and span globally, right? Which what did LBJ say? What did he say? This provides us with the opportunity to develop a system that can determine the world's cloud layers, and ultimately, he who controls the world's cloud layers will control the world, right?
Think about that kind of communication, and think about the opportunity that will provide. It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer, and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control